Imagine standing on a wind-swept island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in 1943, watching as a group of exhausted American soldiers unload wooden crates from a cargo ship. The beach is still scarred from recent combat. Palm trees are shattered, and the jungle beyond smolders from artillery fire. Within hours, something remarkable begins to take shape. From those flat crates emerges a curved structure of gleaming, corrugated steel, rising like a metallic rainbow against the tropical sky. By sunset, what was once an empty patch of mud has become a functioning building, complete with doors, windows, and enough space to shelter dozens of men. This wasn't magic, and it wasn't some futuristic technology from science fiction. It was the Quonset hut, one of the most ingenious yet overlooked innovations of the entire Second World War. While historians love to talk about tanks rumbling across European fields and bombers darkening the skies over Germany, they often skip over the unglamorous truth that wars are won as much by logistics as by firepower. You can have the bravest soldiers in the world, but if they're sleeping in mud, getting drenched by monsoons and shivering through freezing nights, their effectiveness drops like a stone. The human body can only take so much punishment before it breaks down, and in a global conflict stretching from the Arctic to the tropics, keeping millions of men sheltered became one of the most critical challenges the United States military faced. Before we dive into how America solved this problem, let's set the stage properly. By the time Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the world was already burning. Europe had been at war since 1939, with that infamous Austrian painter and his fascist regime rolling through Poland, France, and beyond. Britain stood nearly alone, enduring nightly bombing raids that turned London into a hellscape of rubble and fire. In the East, Japan had been waging brutal campaigns across China and Southeast Asia, carving out an empire with shocking speed and ruthlessness. America had tried to stay out of the mess, but Pearl Harbor changed everything in a single Sunday morning. Suddenly, the United States found itself committed to fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, a logistical undertaking of staggering complexity. The scale of the mobilization was unprecedented in American history. Within months, millions of young men who had been working on farms, in factories, or attending college were transformed into soldiers, sailors, and Marines. They were trained hastily at bases across the country, then loaded onto ships and sent to places most of them had never heard of before. Island names like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan meant nothing to these boys from Iowa, Texas, and New York, but they would soon become intimately familiar with them. In Europe, troops prepared for eventual landings in North Africa and later France, while in the frozen north, men were dispatched to Alaska and the Aleutian Islands to counter Japanese expansion. The diversity of these environments created a nightmare scenario for military planners. How do you create a standardized shelter solution that works equally well in tropical heat and Arctic cold, in desert sand and jungle mud, on remote islands and continental battlefields? Traditional military infrastructure took far too long to construct. Wooden barracks required lumber, skilled carpenters, and weeks of labor. Stone or brick buildings were even more time-consuming and required materials that were in short supply during wartime. Tents were portable, but offered almost no protection against harsh weather and wore out quickly in extreme conditions. Soldiers huddled in canvas tents during Pacific typhoons or European winters were miserable, sick, and combat ineffective. The military brass understood that they needed something revolutionary, something that had never been done before at this scale. They needed buildings that could be manufactured in American factories, shipped across oceans in the holds of cargo vessels, and then assembled rapidly by troops with minimal construction experience. These structures had to be strong enough to withstand hurricane winds, heavy enough to stay anchored in place, yet light enough to transport efficiently. They needed to keep out rain, provide decent insulation, and last for months or even years in hostile environments. Oh, and by the way, they needed about 100,000 of them, and they needed them yesterday. This is where the story gets interesting, because the solution didn't come from some revolutionary new technology or exotic materials. It came from a simple geometric principle that had been understood since ancient times: the arch. Anyone who has ever looked at Roman aqueducts or medieval cathedrals knows that arched structures possess incredible strength relative to their weight. The curved shape distributes forces evenly, allowing the structure to support loads far greater than its individual components could handle alone. What if, someone at the Navy Department wondered, we could create a building that was essentially one giant arch, a half-cylinder of corrugated steel that would be inherently strong, naturally shed rain and snow, and could be manufactured using the same techniques already being used to produce ship hulls and aircraft fuselages? The idea wasn't entirely original. During the First World War, the British had developed something called the Nissen hut, named after its inventor, Major Peter Nissen. These structures had been used extensively on the Western Front to house troops behind the lines. They were semi-cylindrical buildings made of corrugated iron, mounted on a steel frame. Thousands had been built during that earlier conflict, and many were still standing across Britain and France 2 decades later. American military observers had noted these structures during visits to British bases and had filed away the concept as potentially useful. But the Nissen hut had its limitations. It was designed during a different era of warfare, when armies moved more slowly and supply chains were shorter. The American military wanted something better, something that could be mass-produced using modern manufacturing techniques and assembled even more quickly. They wanted a distinctly American version, optimized for the kind of industrial production that had made the United States the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. In early 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, but with war clearly looming on the horizon, the Navy Department put out a request for proposals. They needed a new type of portable building, and they needed it fast. The specifications were demanding but clear. The structure had to be lightweight enough to ship efficiently, strong enough to survive extreme weather, simple enough for untrained personnel to assemble, and cheap enough to produce in massive quantities. It also had to be adaptable, capable of serving as everything from sleeping quarters to hospitals to warehouses. The contract went to the George A. Fuller Company, a respected construction firm with experience in military projects. They established a design team at the Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center in Quonset Point, Rhode Island. The location would prove prophetic, lending its name to the resulting structure. Throughout the spring and summer of 1941, engineers and architects worked around the clock to refine the design. They experimented with different dimensions, materials, and assembly methods. Early prototypes were built and stress-tested, subjected to simulated wind loads and temperature extremes. The team borrowed elements from the Nissen hut, but improved on them in crucial ways. The framework was simplified, the assembly process streamlined, and the materials were chosen to take advantage of America's industrial capacity. The final design they settled on was elegantly simple. Picture a half-cylinder, 16 feet wide and 36 feet long, constructed from corrugated steel sheets that form both the walls and the roof in one continuous curve. The steel was galvanized to resist rust, and the corrugations provided rigidity while keeping the weight manageable. At each end of the cylinder, plywood panels could be installed with cutouts for doors and windows. The entire structure sat on a simple foundation, which could be anything from wooden skids to poured concrete, depending on how permanent the installation needed to be. Inside, wooden flooring kept occupants off the ground, and the curved walls could be lined with insulation material if needed for cold climates. What made the design truly revolutionary was how it could be packaged and shipped. Every component was designed to nest together efficiently. The curved steel panels stacked flat, the framework disassembled into manageable pieces, and all the bolts, nuts, and fasteners were packaged in clearly labeled boxes. A complete hut kit weighed about 5 tons, which sounds heavy until you realize that traditional wooden barracks required far more material and took up much more shipping space. The instruction manual that came with each kit was a masterpiece of clarity, written for men who might never have used a wrench before the war. It spelled out every step with simple diagrams and clear language, the military equivalent of assembling furniture, except this furniture could house 40 men and withstand a typhoon. By the time the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Quonset hut design was finalized and ready for mass production. What the designers couldn't have known was just how crucial their invention would become. Over the next 4 years, these unassuming steel half-cylinders would spread across the globe like a metallic rash, popping up on every continent except Antarctica. They would house soldiers in steaming jungles and frozen tundra, serve as field hospitals where surgeons operated by lamplight, function as chapels where men prayed before going into battle, and become command centers where generals planned operations that would change the course of history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, America had to build them, and build them by the tens of thousands. The industrial mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor was one of the most impressive feats of manufacturing in human history. Factories that had been producing cars, appliances, and consumer goods were converted almost overnight to produce weapons, vehicles, and military equipment. Steel mills ran around the clock, shipyards launched vessels at an unprecedented pace, and aircraft factories churned out bombers and fighters by the thousands. In this context, adding Quonset huts to the production schedule might seem like a small thing, but the numbers involved were staggering. The Fuller Company wasn't the only manufacturer for long. As demand skyrocketed, contracts were awarded to companies across the country. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest retooled their assembly lines to produce the standardized components. The beauty of the design was that it required no specialized equipment, just standard industrial metalworking tools that most factories already possessed. Workers who had been stamping out automobile fenders now stamped out corrugated steel panels for huts. Women who had been riveting aircraft fuselages applied those same skills to assembling hut frameworks. The standardization was absolute. Every panel was identical to every other panel of the same type. Every bolt hole was drilled in exactly the same location. This meant that components from different factories were completely interchangeable, which was crucial for logistics. A hut damaged in the Pacific could be repaired using spare parts shipped from any warehouse, anywhere in the supply chain. There was no need to worry about whether parts from different batches would fit together, because everything was built to the same exacting specifications. Production ramped up with astonishing speed. By mid-1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, factories were producing hundreds of huts per week. By 1943, the number had climbed into the thousands. Workers became incredibly efficient at their tasks, and quality control procedures ensured that defective components were caught before they were shipped overseas. The logistics of distribution were equally impressive. Hut kits were loaded into the holds of Liberty ships alongside ammunition, rations, vehicles, and all the other supplies needed to sustain armies overseas. They sailed across the Atlantic to Britain and North Africa, and across the Pacific to Australia and island bases. Navy cargo vessels transported them to remote atolls where construction battalions, the famous Seabees, waited to assemble them. The Seabees deserve special mention here because they became the unsung heroes of the Quonset hut story. These construction battalions were made up of men with backgrounds in building trades, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and general laborers who had been recruited specifically for their practical skills. When they arrived at a new location, often on the heels of combat troops who had just secured a beachhead, their job was to transform raw land into a functioning military base as quickly as possible. This meant clearing jungle or leveling ground, building roads and airstrips, digging latrines and wells, and of course erecting buildings. Quonset huts were their bread and butter, and they became incredibly fast at putting them up. A well-practiced crew could have a hut standing in under 8 hours, sometimes even faster if they were motivated by incoming weather or enemy threats. The process became almost rhythmic. First, the foundation would be prepared, which might be as simple as leveling the ground and laying down wooden skids, or as complex as pouring concrete pads. Then the steel framework would be assembled, which consisted of a series of arched ribs that formed the skeleton of the structure. These ribs were bolted together and lifted into position, creating the distinctive half-cylinder shape. Next came the corrugated steel sheets, which were attached to the framework, starting from the bottom and working upward. Each panel overlapped the one below it, creating a weatherproof skin. The panels were secured with special bolts that had rubber washers to prevent leaks. Finally, the end walls were installed, complete with doors and windows, and any interior finishing like flooring or insulation was added. The entire process required minimal tools, mostly wrenches, hammers, and measuring tapes. There were no power tools in most cases, just muscle power and determination. The men who built these huts often worked in brutal conditions, under blazing tropical sun or in cold rain, sometimes with enemy aircraft still threatening overhead. But they kept building because they knew that every hut meant better shelter for their fellow soldiers, sailors, or Marines. As production continued throughout 1942 and 1943, refinements were made to the basic design. The original 16-foot width proved too narrow for some applications, so a 20-foot wide version was developed. Then came an even larger variant, 40 feet wide, for uses that required more interior space, like mess halls or recreation buildings. Longer versions were created by simply adding more sections in the middle, extending the structure to 48, 60, or even 80 feet in length. The modular nature of the design meant that huts could be connected end-to-end or side-by-side to create larger complexes. By 1944, entire bases had been built using nothing but Quonset huts, arranged in neat rows like metal suburbs. These bases had everything a military installation needed, all under those characteristic curved roofs. There were barracks for sleeping, mess halls for eating, hospitals for treating the wounded, warehouses for storing supplies, shops for repairing equipment, offices for administration, and even chapels for worship. Walking through one of these bases must have been a surreal experience. The repetitive geometry of the huts created an almost alien landscape, especially in remote locations where they stood in stark contrast to the natural environment. Yet they also brought a sense of order and civilization to places that had been wilderness just weeks before. The psychological impact of having a real building over your head rather than a tent or makeshift shelter was significant for troop morale. Men appreciated having solid walls around them, even if those walls were steel rather than wood or brick. The statistics tell an incredible story. By the end of 1945, more than 150,000 Quonset huts had been manufactured and shipped around the world. That's not 150 or 1,500, but 150,000 individual structures. If you lined them up end to end, they would stretch for over 1,000 miles. If you calculated the total enclosed space they provided, it would equal millions of square feet of climate-controlled shelter. The cost was equally impressive in its efficiency. Each hut cost the government only a few $100s to manufacture, which was a fraction of what traditional construction would have required. When you factored in the savings from reduced shipping costs, faster assembly times, and the ability to reuse or relocate the structures, the economic advantage became overwhelming. The Quonset hut represented the kind of practical problem-solving that characterized American industry during the war years. It wasn't flashy or glamorous. Nobody was going to write songs about steel huts the way they did about bombers or battleships. But in its own quiet way, the Quonset hut was as important to victory as any weapons system. It enabled America to project power globally by providing the infrastructure necessary to sustain military operations in any environment. Without these huts, bases would have taken far longer to establish. Troops would have suffered more from exposure to the elements, and the logistical advantage that helped win the war would have been significantly reduced. Now, let's talk about what it was actually like to live inside one of these things, because the experience varied wildly depending on where you were stationed. A soldier serving on a tropical island in the South Pacific had a completely different relationship with his Quonset hut than a guy stationed in Alaska or the Aleutian Islands. In the Pacific Theater, where temperatures rarely dropped below 70 degrees and humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, the huts could be stifling during the day. The steel walls absorbed heat from the tropical sun, turning the interior into something resembling an oven by mid-afternoon. Soldiers learned quickly to avoid being inside during the hottest hours, instead conducting their duties in whatever shade they could find outside. Ventilation was crucial, so troops would prop open both end doors to create a cross breeze, and some enterprising units would cut additional openings in the walls or install fans salvaged from ships or aircraft. At night, the huts cooled down somewhat, but they never really became comfortable. Mosquito netting was essential, draped over bunks to keep out the clouds of insects that swarmed after dark. The sound of rain on the corrugated steel roof was deafening during tropical downpours, which were frequent and intense. Men learned to sleep through the noise, or maybe they were just so exhausted from their duties that nothing could keep them awake. The bunks inside were basic, either metal frames with thin mattresses or sometimes just canvas cots. Personal space was minimal. In a standard barracks hut, you might have 24 to 40 men living in close quarters, their gear hanging from hooks on the walls or stowed in footlockers under their bunks. Privacy was non-existent, which could be tough for guys who were used to having their own rooms back home, but military life has never been about privacy, and most men adjusted to the communal living situation. What the huts did provide was protection from the elements, which was no small thing in the tropics. During monsoon seasons, when rain fell in sheets for days at a time, the huts kept men relatively dry. During the occasional tropical storm or typhoon, the curved shape and sturdy construction meant that while the huts might shake and groan, they generally stayed intact when tents would have been shredded. There were stories of huts surviving direct hits from falling trees or near-miss artillery shells, testament to the strength of that simple arched design. In the European theater, conditions were different, but no less challenging. After the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944, Quonset huts began appearing across France as the armies pushed inland. Here, they served primarily as support facilities behind the front lines. Field hospitals were often set up in clusters of huts, where wounded men were brought from the battlefield for emergency surgery and recovery. The huts provided sterile environments that were far superior to tents, with solid walls that could be cleaned and disinfected, and roofs that didn't leak during the frequent French rains. By winter, as the fighting moved into Belgium and Germany, the weather turned brutally cold. Quonset huts in these regions were equipped with stoves, typically potbelly stoves or larger heating units that burned coal or wood. The challenge was keeping heat in, since steel is an excellent conductor and the curved walls radiated warmth away quickly. Insulation helped, and many huts had their interiors lined with whatever materials were available, from official insulation bats to improvised barriers of cardboard or canvas. Even with heating, the huts were often chilly, especially near the walls and floor. Men slept in their uniforms, sometimes with extra blankets piled on their cots. The moisture from their breath and the heating stoves would condense on the cold steel walls, running down in streams and creating puddles on the floor. It wasn't pleasant, but it was still better than being in a foxhole in the snow, which was where many of those men would be heading when they rotated back to the front lines. In the far north, Alaska and the Aleutian Islands presented perhaps the most extreme conditions. Here, Quonset huts had to withstand not just cold, but powerful winds that howled across treeless landscapes with nothing to slow them. The curved shape proved ideal for these conditions, as wind flowed over the huts rather than catching flat surfaces and creating pressure that could tear structures apart. Anchoring was critical. Huts in these regions were typically mounted on deeper foundations and sometimes had additional guy wires or anchors to keep them in place during storms. Inside, multiple stoves were needed to maintain livable temperatures, and fuel consumption was a constant concern. Supply lines to these remote posts were tenuous, and running out of heating fuel in an Alaskan winter could be life-threatening. Despite these challenges, the huts performed admirably. Troops stationed in these frozen outposts might have complained about the cold, the isolation, and the monotony, but they recognized that their metal shelters were keeping them alive. The versatility of the Quonset hut really shone through in the variety of uses it was adapted for, beyond simple barracks. Medical huts were particularly important, serving as everything from first aid stations to full surgical theaters. In the Pacific, where tropical diseases like malaria and dengue fever struck down more men than Japanese bullets in some campaigns, having proper medical facilities was crucial. A Quonset hut could be converted into a 20-bed ward in a matter of hours, with cots arranged in rows, medical supplies organized on improvised shelving, and surgical equipment sterilized and ready for use. Doctors and nurses worked under those curved steel roofs, performing operations by the light of lamps and generators, fighting to save lives in conditions that would have been unthinkable in civilian hospitals back home. Chapel huts provided spiritual solace to men far from home and facing the possibility of death daily. Military chaplains of all faiths held services in these converted structures, which might feature a simple wooden altar at one end, rows of benches or folding chairs, and perhaps some makeshift decorations to create a sense of sacred space. Men who hadn't been particularly religious before the war often found comfort in these services, and the chaplains who conducted them became important figures in military communities. Command and operations huts served as the brains of military bases. These structures housed communication equipment, maps, planning tables, and the officers who coordinated complex operations across vast distances. Inside a cramped Quonset hut on some remote island, decisions might be made that would affect thousands of lives and determine the outcome of battles. Radio operators worked around the clock, maintaining contact with ships at sea, aircraft in the sky, and headquarters thousands of miles away. Intelligence officers analyzed reconnaissance reports and enemy movements. Planners plotted the next offensive. The hut became the nerve center of military operations, its curved walls containing secrets and strategies that couldn't be allowed to leak. Recreation huts offered brief respites from the stress of military life. These might be set up as movie theaters with a screen at one end and rows of seating where men could watch films shipped from Hollywood. Others served as libraries with paperback books donated by organizations back home, lining makeshift shelves. Some became clubs where troops could gather to play cards, write letters, or just talk with their buddies. The military recognized that morale was crucial to maintaining fighting effectiveness, and providing spaces for relaxation helped keep spirits up even in the harshest conditions. Mess halls were among the most important uses of the larger Quonset huts. Feeding hundreds or thousands of men required substantial kitchen facilities and dining spaces. The 40-foot wide huts were often used for this purpose, with one end set up as a kitchen, complete with stoves, ovens, and prep tables, while the rest of the space was filled with long tables and benches. The food served in these mess halls might not have been gourmet cuisine, but it was hot, reasonably nutritious, and served in quantities sufficient to keep men fueled for their demanding duties. There's something about eating together under a roof that builds camaraderie, and mess halls became social centers where men from different units mixed and swapped stories. Storage and warehouse huts kept mountains of supplies organized and protected from the elements. Everything from ammunition to spare parts to medical supplies to food rations had to be stored somewhere, and Quonset huts were ideal for this purpose. They could be locked securely, kept relatively dry inside, and organized with shelving or stacking systems. Supply sergeants, those unsung heroes of military logistics, ran tight ships in their warehouse huts, maintaining inventories and ensuring that needed items could be located quickly when requisitioned. The adaptability of the Quonset hut design meant that as needs changed, huts could be repurposed. A barracks might be converted into a warehouse when troop levels decreased. A storage hut might become a workshop when repair facilities were needed. This flexibility was invaluable in the fluid situations that characterized wartime operations, where requirements could change overnight based on strategic decisions or enemy actions. Personal accounts from veterans who lived in Quonset huts reveal a mix of appreciation and frustration. Many spoke of the noise, how every rain shower became a thunderous drumming on the steel roof, how wind made the whole structure creak and groan, how footsteps on the wooden floor echoed in the curved space. They remembered the smell, a combination of metal, wood, mildew, and whatever personal items men kept in their cramped spaces. They recalled the lack of privacy, how every conversation could be overheard, how there was no escaping the presence of dozens of other men. But they also remembered the sense of security the huts provided, the relief of having solid walls and a waterproof roof, especially after experiencing the misery of tent life or field conditions. One Marine who served in the Pacific wrote home describing his Quonset hut as looking like somebody cut a big tin can in half and stuck doors on the ends, which was actually a pretty accurate description. He went on to say that it might not be much, but it beats sleeping in a hole in the ground, which summed up the pragmatic attitude most servicemen had toward their steel homes. They might joke about them, complain about the heat or cold, but fundamentally they recognized that the huts were a significant improvement over the alternatives. As the war progressed and American forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, Quonset huts followed like a trailing wake of steel arcs. Every captured island in the Pacific, every liberated town in Europe, every newly established base in any theater of war soon sprouted these distinctive structures. They became so ubiquitous that they were simply part of the landscape of war, as common and expected as jeeps, helmets, and sea rations. Aerial photographs of military installations from this period show hundreds of huts arranged in orderly grids, creating patterns that are instantly recognizable even decades later. The global spread of Quonset huts during World War II was nothing short of remarkable, creating what amounted to a steel archipelago stretching across every ocean and continent where American forces operated. To truly understand the scale, we need to follow these structures as they moved around the world, adapting to climates and conditions their designers in Rhode Island could barely imagine. In the Pacific Theater, the huts became synonymous with American island hopping campaigns. After Marines and Army troops secured a beachhead, often at tremendous cost in lives, the construction battalions would arrive within days to begin the transformation from battleground to base. Take Guadalcanal, for example, that bloody campaign in the Solomon Islands that raged from August 1942 to February 1943. Once American forces had established control of Henderson Field, the critical airstrip at the heart of the fighting, Quonset huts began arriving by the shipload. Within weeks, the airfield was surrounded by a growing complex of steel buildings housing pilots, ground crews, maintenance personnel, medical staff, and command officers. The huts provided crucial protection during the frequent Japanese air raids, as their low profile and sturdy construction made them less vulnerable than taller wooden structures would have been. Further north in the Pacific, the Aleutian Islands campaign showcased the huts' cold weather capabilities. When Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska in June 1942, it marked the only time during the war that enemy troops held American soil. The campaign to retake these islands was fought in some of the most miserable conditions imaginable, with constant fog, freezing rain, and winds that could knock a man off his feet. Yet Quonset huts, anchored firmly to permafrost foundations, provided American troops with shelters that could withstand the brutal weather. Pilots flying missions against Japanese positions on Kiska lived in heated huts that, while hardly luxurious, kept them alive and combat-ready in conditions that would have been fatal in lesser accommodations. As American forces drove across the Central Pacific, capturing islands like Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, and Guam, the pattern repeated itself. Each newly won island became a stepping stone toward Japan, and each stepping stone needed infrastructure to support bombers, fighters, supply ships, and the troops who manned them. Quonset huts turned barren coral atolls into bustling military cities almost overnight. On Saipan, captured in July 1944, the Americans built massive airfields that would serve as bases for B-29 superfortresses to bomb the Japanese home islands. The support facilities for these operations sprawled across the island, thousands of Quonset huts housing everyone from pilots to mechanics to cooks to medical personnel. The infrastructure was so extensive that aerial reconnaissance photos show the island nearly covered with the distinctive curved roofs. In the European theatre, the distribution was somewhat different, but no less comprehensive. Britain became a vast staging ground for the eventual invasion of France, and American troops arriving there from 1942 onward found Quonset huts waiting for them or arriving shortly thereafter. East Anglia, the region of England closest to continental Europe, became particularly dense with American air bases, each one supporting squadrons of B-17 and B-24 bombers that flew daylight raids over Germany. These bases were sprawling complexes where Quonset huts served every imaginable function. Crews who flew the daylight bombing missions, arguably some of the most dangerous duty in the war, returned from their harrowing flights to rest and recover in Quonset barracks. The casualty rates for bomber crews were horrific, with some groups losing entire squadrons over the course of the war. The familiar curved walls of their huts became sanctuaries where exhausted men could try to sleep despite knowing they might not survive their next mission. Ground crews, who maintained the bombers, worked in huts converted to workshops, repairing battle damage and keeping the aircraft flying despite the incredible strain of combat operations. The North African campaign saw Quonset huts deployed in desert conditions that tested their versatility in different ways. From Morocco to Tunisia, as Allied forces pushed Axis troops back across the continent in 1942 and 1943, the huts arrived to support the advancing armies. Here the challenge wasn't cold or rain, but heat, sand, and dust. The curved steel roofs that had been designed partly to shed snow and rain in temperate climates proved equally effective at reflecting the intense desert sun. Inside, temperatures were still uncomfortably hot during the day, but the shade provided by the structure made them more bearable than tents, which offered almost no protection from the heat. Sand proved to be a persistent problem, infiltrating every crack and seam, but the solid construction of the huts meant that, unlike tents, they didn't get shredded by sandstorms. After the Allied landings in Italy in September 1943, Quonset huts followed the armies as they fought their way up the Italian peninsula. The mountainous terrain and harsh winter conditions of the Italian campaign made the huts particularly valuable. Field hospitals set up in huts near the front lines treated the steady stream of casualties from battles like Monte Cassino and Anzio. These medical facilities saved countless lives by providing sterile, weatherproof environments for surgery and recovery. The terrible Italian winter of 1943–44 might have been even more devastating to Allied forces without the shelter the huts provided. Perhaps the most dramatic deployment came after D-Day on June 6, 1944. As Allied forces poured ashore in Normandy and began the liberation of France, the logistical tail stretched back across the English Channel to Britain. Supplies and men flowed continuously through the beachheads, and establishing secure, functional bases was crucial to maintaining the momentum of the advance. Quonset huts were among the first structures erected once the beaches were secured. Temporary ports and supply dumps were surrounded by clusters of huts that housed the thousands of support troops needed to keep the combat units supplied and moving forward. As the armies swept across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, the huts followed. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, there were Quonset huts scattered across Western Europe from the Atlantic to the Elbe River. Some had been erected and abandoned as armies moved forward, left behind as monuments to the rapid advance. Others remained in use as part of the occupation forces that would govern defeated Germany for years to come. In the China-Burma-India theater, perhaps the most challenging and overlooked campaign of the war, Quonset huts provided vital support for operations in incredibly difficult terrain and climate. The units fighting in Burma's jungles or flying supplies over the Himalayan hump into China relied on bases where huts protected men and equipment from monsoon rains that could last for months. The combination of heat, humidity, and torrential rain tested the huts' durability to the limit, but they generally held up better than any alternative available. Even in the continental United States, Quonset huts became a common sight at military bases, training camps, and industrial facilities. The massive mobilization meant that bases were expanding rapidly to train millions of recruits, and traditional construction couldn't keep pace with demand. Quonset huts filled the gap, providing barracks, classrooms, and support facilities at installations across the country. From Texas to Washington State, from Florida to Maine, these steel structures became temporary homes for young men learning how to be soldiers before shipping overseas. What's striking when you look at the global distribution is how the huts created a kind of architectural continuity across vastly different environments. A soldier transferring from Alaska to the Philippines or from Britain to North Africa would find the same familiar curved roofs waiting for him at his new posting. There was something psychologically comforting about this standardization, a reminder that despite being thousands of miles from home, you were still part of the same vast American military machine. The structures were recognizable markers of American presence and power. Allied forces recognized them as symbols of American industrial might and organizational efficiency. Enemy forces learned to identify them from reconnaissance photos, knowing that where Quonset huts clustered, there you would find significant American military activity. The huts became targets for bombing raids and artillery fire, though their low profile and sturdy construction meant they often survived attacks that would have destroyed wooden buildings. Local populations in occupied or liberated territories viewed the huts with a mixture of curiosity and awe. To civilians who had lived through years of shortages and deprivation, the sight of Americans rapidly constructing entire bases complete with hundreds of buildings was impressive evidence of the vast resources the United States could bring to bear. In some cases, the huts became symbols of liberation and hope. French civilians watching them go up near Normandy beaches knew they represented American commitment to driving out the Nazi occupiers. Pacific Islanders who had endured brutal Japanese occupation saw the huts as evidence that powerful friends had arrived. The sheer logistics of distributing over 150,000 structures worldwide during the war years is mind-boggling when you really think about it. Each hut kit had to be manufactured, quality-checked, packaged, transported to ports, loaded onto ships, sailed across oceans threatened by submarines and aircraft, unloaded at destinations that might be under enemy fire, transported inland by truck or smaller craft, and finally assembled by crews who might be working under combat conditions. The fact that this system worked as well as it did speaks volumes about American organizational capabilities during the war. Of course, not everything went smoothly. Ships carrying hut kits were sunk by enemy action or storms, resulting in shortages at forward bases. Kits sometimes arrived with missing parts, requiring improvisation and cannibalization from damaged huts. Assembly instructions got lost or destroyed, forcing crews to figure out construction by trial and error. Typhoons occasionally tore huts from their foundations despite their sturdy design. Enemy bombs and shells scored direct hits, turning huts into twisted wreckage. But these losses were factored into planning. The military ordered extras knowing some would never reach their destinations or would be destroyed in action. The production capacity was sufficient to replace losses and continue the steady expansion of infrastructure wherever American forces operated. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Quonset hut had become one of the most widely distributed artifacts of American civilization. They stood in every climate zone, on every continent where the war had been fought, silent witnesses to the greatest conflict in human history. They had housed the men who won the war, sheltered the wounded and dying, protected vital equipment and supplies, and served as temporary homes for millions far from their real homes. The war was over, but the story of the Quonset hut was far from finished. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. The challenge now would be figuring out what to do with all these steel structures scattered across the globe. And as it turned out, peacetime would find new uses for them that their original designers never imagined. When the guns finally fell silent in the summer of 1945, the world faced the enormous challenge of transitioning from total war back to something resembling normal life. For the United States, this meant demobilizing millions of service members, retooling factories from military to civilian production, and dealing with a massive inventory of war material that was suddenly surplus to requirements. Among that material were tens of thousands of Quonset huts, and the question became, what do you do with 100,000 portable steel buildings when you no longer need them for war? The military's first instinct was purely practical. Some huts were simply abandoned in place, left standing at overseas bases that were being decommissioned. In remote Pacific islands, huts were left to the elements, gradually rusting and deteriorating under the tropical sun and salt air. Some of these abandoned structures still stand today, slowly being reclaimed by jungle vegetation, rusting memorials to a conflict that reshaped the world. In other locations, particularly in Europe and more populated areas, huts were dismantled and the steel sold as scrap. Metal was valuable in the post-war period, and the corrugated sheets could be recycled into new products. But scrapping huts was labor-intensive and time-consuming, and there were so many of them that the process would have taken years. Meanwhile, back in the United States, a different crisis was brewing that would give the Quonset hut an unexpected second life. Millions of veterans were coming home, and many of them were getting married and starting families, thanks in part to the GI Bill that provided loans and education benefits. This created an unprecedented demand for housing and educational facilities, just as construction materials and skilled labor were still in short supply. The nation faced a severe housing shortage in the late 1940s, with returning veterans competing for apartments and houses that simply didn't exist in sufficient numbers. At the same time, colleges and universities were being flooded with applicants taking advantage of the GI Bill's education benefits. Institutions that had been half empty during the war years suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with enrollment. Classrooms were packed, dormitories were full beyond capacity, and there was no time to construct traditional campus buildings before the fall semester began. Someone, somewhere, had a brilliant idea. Why not use the surplus Quonset huts? They were designed to house people in difficult conditions. They could be erected quickly, and the government had plenty of them sitting unused. Thus began one of the most unusual chapters in American architectural history: the transformation of military structures into civilian housing and educational facilities. The War Assets Administration began selling surplus huts to colleges, universities, municipalities, and private buyers at bargain prices. A hut that had cost the government a few $100s to produce might sell for even less, sometimes just the cost of dismantling and transporting it. Organizations snapped them up by the hundreds. Across American college campuses, Quonset villages sprang up almost overnight, temporary communities built to house the wave of veteran students. These villages were far from luxurious. A typical setup involved converting huts into small apartments, often by dividing the interior into sections with plywood partitions. A single hut might house 2 or even 4 families, each with their own cramped living space but sharing bathroom facilities. Furniture was basic, often surplus military goods or donated items. Heating in winter was challenging, cooling in summer nearly impossible. Yet for the young couples moving into these metal cylinders, they represented something precious: affordable housing and a chance to start building their lives. At the University of Wisconsin in Madison, several dozen Quonset huts were erected in what became known as Badger Village, housing hundreds of married students. The community developed its own social life, with residents organizing potluck dinners, babysitting cooperatives, and social events. Similar villages appeared at universities across the country, from Quonset Park at Iowa State to Vettville at the University of Minnesota. These communities became legendary in campus lore, places where future doctors, lawyers, teachers, and engineers lived in conditions that weren't much better than their military service, but did so willingly because education represented their path to the American dream. The children who grew up in these Quonset villages, sleeping in curved metal rooms and playing in the spaces between the huts, had unique childhoods. Some remember it fondly as a time of community and shared purpose, where all the families were in similar circumstances and everyone helped each other. Others recall the hardships, the thin walls that provided no sound privacy, the summer heat that turned the huts into ovens, the winter cold that seeped through inadequate insulation. One common memory was the distinctive acoustic quality of life in a Quonset hut, how sound echoed strangely off the curved walls, how rain sounded like being inside a drum. Beyond universities, surplus huts found homes in countless other civilian applications. In rural areas, farmers purchased them to use as barns, equipment sheds, or storage facilities. The same qualities that made them good military buildings, weatherproof, rodent-resistant, and durable, made them excellent for agricultural use. Drive through farming country in states like Iowa, Nebraska, or Kansas even today, and you might spot an old Quonset hut that started life on some Pacific island before ending up as a corn crib in the Midwest. Small businesses discovered that huts made affordable starter spaces. An entrepreneur with more ambition than capital could buy a surplus hut, set it up on a vacant lot, and suddenly have a workshop, store, or office. Auto repair shops, small manufacturing operations, warehouses, and countless other enterprises got their start in repurposed Quonset huts. Some of these businesses eventually moved into conventional buildings as they grew, but others remained in their curved steel homes for decades. Churches found the huts particularly useful. Congregations that were too small or too poor to afford traditional church buildings could acquire a hut and convert it into a house of worship. With some interior finishing, installation of pews or folding chairs, and perhaps a simple altar or pulpit at one end, a Quonset chapel could serve a community's spiritual needs adequately. The acoustics were actually reasonably good for singing and preaching, and the distinctive shape gave the spaces a kind of humble dignity. Some of these church huts remained in use well into the 1960s and beyond, serving their congregations faithfully long after anyone remembered they had once housed soldiers. Community centers, scout halls, veterans organizations, and fraternal lodges all made use of surplus huts. The structures were ideal for gatherings, spacious enough to hold meetings or events, yet simple enough that volunteer labor could maintain them. In small towns across America, the local VFW, or American Legion Post, might operate out of a Quonset hut, a fitting headquarters given the military origins of the structure. Perhaps most importantly, huts helped address the housing crisis directly by being converted into temporary homes. While the college Quonset villages were the most organized example of this, individual huts were also purchased by families desperate for any kind of shelter. With considerable effort and some construction skill, a hut could be transformed into a reasonably comfortable small house. Interior walls divided the space into rooms, windows were added for light and ventilation, insulation was installed and covered with wallboard, and exterior finishes like wood siding sometimes disguised the building's military origins. The results were never architecturally distinguished, but they provided roofs over the heads of families who might otherwise have been homeless or forced to double up with relatives. The federal government actually encouraged this repurposing as part of the effort to address the housing shortage. The Veterans Emergency Housing Program actively promoted the conversion of surplus military structures into civilian housing, and Quonset huts were a major component of this initiative. Manuals were published explaining how to winterize and finish the interiors. Loans were made available to help veterans purchase and modify the huts. In some cases, entire neighborhoods of converted Quonset huts appeared, creating communities where the curved roofs dominated the streetscape. These Quonset neighborhoods had a distinctive character. The buildings might be dressed up with paint, shutters, flower boxes, and landscaping, but the underlying form was always recognizable. They represented a moment in American history when housing shortages and available surplus material combined to create an architectural oddity, subdivisions of steel cylinders where families lived, loved, raised children, and built their post-war lives. The phenomenon wasn't limited to the United States. In countries where American forces had been stationed during the war, local populations also found uses for the huts left behind. In Britain, bomb-damaged cities still recovering from the Blitz used Quonset huts and their British Nissen cousins as temporary housing and community facilities. In the Philippines, Guam, and other Pacific locations, huts became permanent parts of the landscape, repurposed into homes, shops, and public buildings. The structures that had represented American military power became artifacts of reconstruction and recovery. Over time, most of these civilian Quonset huts disappeared. As prosperity returned and conventional housing became available, the need for makeshift shelter diminished. College Quonset villages were dismantled as proper dormitories were built. Families moved out of their metal cylinders into traditional houses. Businesses relocated to commercial buildings. Churches constructed proper sanctuaries. By the 1960s, the Great Quonset diaspora was largely over, with the structures either torn down or relegated to purely utilitarian purposes like storage. Yet the experience left a lasting impression on a generation. For millions of Americans, living in a Quonset hut was part of their personal narrative, a chapter in their life story that they would remember and recount to children and grandchildren. It became part of the collective memory of the post-war generation, symbolizing both the challenges they faced and their resourcefulness in overcoming them. The Quonset hut era represented a moment when Americans made do with what they had, adapted military surplus to civilian needs, and built lives in whatever spaces were available. It wasn't glamorous or elegant, but it was deeply practical, characteristic of a generation that had just survived depression and war and was determined to move forward however they could. In a strange way, the peacetime career of the Quonset hut was as impressive as its wartime service. These structures had helped win a global conflict, then helped rebuild society afterward. They had been designed as temporary shelters for soldiers, but they ended up housing students, worshippers, businesses, and families. They demonstrated an adaptability that went far beyond their original purpose, proving that good design is design that can evolve to meet changing needs. Looking back now, from the perspective of the 21st century, the Quonset hut phenomenon seems almost quaint, a relic of a simpler time when people were willing to live in converted military buildings because that was what was available. We're accustomed now to expecting new purpose-built structures, and the idea of converting war surplus into housing seems almost absurd. But for the generation that lived through those years, it was perfectly normal. They had just endured years of rationing, shortages, and sacrifice. Living in a steel half-cylinder was just another adaptation, another way of making things work with available resources. The story of the Quonset hut's civilian career also highlights something important about American culture in the immediate post-war period. There was a sense of collective purpose and shared sacrifice that made people willing to accept less than ideal living conditions as temporary measures on the path to something better. The couples living in Quonset villages on college campuses knew they were working toward degrees that would lead to careers and eventually better housing. The families buying surplus huts to convert into homes understood they were bridging a gap until normal construction could resume. Everyone was in it together, dealing with the same challenges, making the same compromises. This social cohesion would begin to fray in later decades, but in the late 1940s and early 1950s, it was strong enough that people could look at a corrugated steel military structure and see not just an ugly building, but an opportunity, a solution, a chance to move forward with their lives. And move forward they did, transforming those metal shells into incubators for the post-war American dream. Places where the future was imagined and planned, even if the present accommodations left much to be desired.